The Palace of Placentia was a famous Tudor royal residence by the River Thames and was a favorite of Henry VIII and the birthplace of future queens Mary and Elizabeth. It was here, in the summer of 1553, that King Edward VI spent his final days before succumbing to illness, under circumstances that historians debate to this day. Edward was born on October 12, 1537, the son of King Henry VIII and his third wife, Jane Seymour. He was the long-awaited male heir for whom Henry VIII had broken with the Catholic Church. His birth sparked high hopes for the Tudor dynasty, but tragedy struck early, and Edward's mother Jane died just 12 days after his birth. As Henry's only legitimate son, the young prince was doted upon by his father and the court. Thankfully, we have a visual representation of King Henry's hopes for the child. In this painting from 1538, by Hans Holbein the Younger, the future king is depicted holding a golden rattle, intended to evoke the imagery of his father's royal scepter. The Latin inscription both glorifies Henry VIII and wishes that Edward will surpass the glory of his father in all things. In January 1547, when Edward was only 9, Henry died, and the boy ascended to the English throne. Because of his youth, a regency council was appointed to govern until he came of age. Edward's uncle, the Duke of Somerset, took charge as Lord Protector, ruling in the king's name. Somerset advanced Protestant changes that aligned with Edward's own devout zeal, but his regime faced economic woes and unrest. In 1549, Somerset was ousted by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who then controlled the government. Although Edward grew more assertive in his mid-teens, this duke remained the chief power behind the throne. Despite his age, Edward wasn't a passive figurehead, at least in his teen years. Contemporary accounts suggest he took an active interest in affairs of state, especially religious policy. He was fiercely Protestant and intent on continuing his father's break from Rome, even if that meant pushing further than his father had. Edward's reign lasted only 6 years, 1547 to 1553, but it was pivotal in steering England toward Protestantism. He was the first English monarch raised as a Protestant, and under him the Edwardian Reformation transformed religious life. Key reforms included imposing the Book of Common Prayer on every church, allowing clergy to marry, and commissioning the 42 Articles, a statement on the doctrine of the Church. Through these measures, Protestantism took firm hold in England, aligning the kingdom with the broader Protestant Reformation in Europe. While many of his reforms were rolled back by his Catholic half-sister Mary, Mary's counter-reformation proved temporary. When Elizabeth I took the throne in 1558, she reinstated her brother's Protestant policies. This continuity meant that Edward's reign had planted the seeds of an Anglican church that would endure. Edward's reign was also marked by a succession crisis that underscored his dynastic significance. As Henry VIII's only son, Edward embodied the Tudor hopes for stability, yet he was a minor king who obviously had no children of his own. By early 1553, Edward fell gravely ill, and questions of succession loomed. The law said the crown should pass to Edward's elder half-sister Mary, a Catholic, then to half-sister Elizabeth, a Protestant. Unwilling to see England restored to Catholicism, Edward, guided by John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, attempted to alter the succession. The king ordered a document drafted to exclude both Mary and Elizabeth from the throne. Instead, Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, and by pure coincidence, I'm sure, John Dudley's daughter-in-law, was named as heir to the throne. This gambit failed. When Edward died, Jane was proclaimed queen for just over a week before Mary mustered support and seized the throne. Nonetheless, Edward's desperate bid to install a Protestant successor reveals how important his religious legacy was to him, even in his final days. But let's get to the mystery at hand. Why did a healthy young king take ill and perish, apparently out of nowhere? In early 1553, King Edward's health began to rapidly deteriorate while he was staying at the Palace of Placentia. He developed a high fever and a harsh cough that worsened over several months. Doctors noted that he was coughing up blood and that he was suffering from wasting and swollen limbs, amongst a wide variety of lesser problems. Modern medical analyses conclude that Edward likely succumbed to tuberculosis, possibly complicated by a severe pneumonia. Whatever the precise cause, it was beyond Tudor medicine to cure. An autopsy reportedly found putrefied ulcers in his lungs, stark evidence of advanced disease. On the evening of July 6, 1553, 15-year-old Edward lay on his deathbed. According to the lore, his final words were a plea to God to defend the realm from Catholicism and continue support for the Reformation in England. And with those pleas, Edward VI faded into history. Edward's death was initially kept secret while Northumberland moved to install Lady Jane Grey as queen. Within days, however, Mary Tudor had claimed the throne with popular support. The deceased king was interred at Westminster Abbey on August 8, 1553. Notably, Mary ordered a Catholic funeral mass for her half-brother, which many believed to be an intentional humiliation of his legacy. Naturally, the untimely death of a teenager invited dark rumors. Some contemporaries suspected foul play, whispering that Edward had been slowly poisoned by someone at his court. As evidence, they cited the apparently unusual symptoms he was suffering from, such as his hair falling out and his skin appearing to have a somewhat blue tint. The Duke of Northumberland, who stood to benefit by placing his daughter-in-law on the throne, was the chief suspect in these theories. However, no proof of a plot ever emerged, and modern historians dismiss the poisoning story as implausible. Notably, if the Duke had been involved, he wouldn't be doing much talking about it. In August 1553, he went on trial, and perhaps in an attempt to save his own life and that of his family members, he professed to be Catholic once again. Notably, this didn't work out for him, and he met his end on August 18, 1553. Though, as we'll see in a later segment in this video, one of his sons would go on to be extremely prominent. This trial wasn't related to his alleged involvement in the death of King Edward, but rather related to his attempt to install Lady Jane Grey on the English throne and his promotion of Protestantism. Modern scholars can't entirely dismiss that John Dudley was involved in a poisoning plot against Edward. However, the evidence for it simply isn't there. Notably, at the time, medicinal treatments often did more harm than good, and the symptoms seen by Edward near the end are thought to have been a result of imperfect Tudor medicine. It's more likely that the aggressive treatments given to Edward, which could have included toxic substances like mercury or arsenic, inadvertently worsened his condition. The consensus today is that Edward likely died of tuberculosis, exacerbated by the common medical treatments of the time. In retrospect, Edward VI's legacy is paradoxically one of unrealized potential and significant achievement. Long overshadowed by the reigns of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, Edward's short rule is now recognized as a crucial turning point that paved the way for Protestant England. The liturgical and doctrinal changes he set in motion permanently altered the Church of England. Even though Mary tried to restore Catholicism, Edward's reforms proved resilient, resurfacing under Elizabeth I and cementing his legacy. Many scholars have speculated that had Edward reached maturity, his extreme religious zeal may have led to a much more austere version of Anglicanism. But Edward didn't live to shape such a future. He died at only 15, leaving others to carry on or attempt to roll back his vision. Mary Seymour entered the world at Sudley Castle on August 30th, 1548, as the only child of Dowager Queen Catherine Parr and her husband, Sir Thomas Seymour. Just 6 days after Mary's arrival, Catherine Parr died from childbirth complications. Within 6 months, Mary's father Thomas was executed for treason in March 1549. For Catherine, who had been married 4 times, most notably to King Henry VIII, Mary was her only child. The sole offspring of Henry's last queen was now an orphan in one of the most turbulent courts of the Tudor age. Mary's royal connections made her an important infant. Her mother had been a Queen of England, and her father was the brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour, making Mary a close relative of the Tudor royal family. As the Dowager Queen's daughter, Mary wasn't technically a princess, but she was one of the highest-born children of her generation. She was even named in honor of Henry VIII's elder daughter, Princess Mary, the future Queen Mary, reflecting hopes for the child's lofty future. However, noble birth offered little protection to a baby in the volatile aftermath of King Henry VIII's death. Before his downfall, Thomas Seymour had entrusted Mary's care to Catherine Willoughby, Duchess of Suffolk, a close friend of Catherine Parr. In early 1549, the infant was moved to the Duchess's country seat at Grimsthorpe Castle in Lincolnshire. The Duchess accepted the duty but soon lamented that caring for the orphan was a heavy burden. As the daughter of the Dowager Queen, Mary, though not technically a princess, was expected to be raised in extreme luxury, which strained her guardian's resources. Notably, the Duchess believed that she would receive support from individuals who had prospered under the Queen Dowager. However, those who had become increasingly wealthy from Catherine's favor failed to offer any assistance for her baby daughter's upkeep. The Crown had allotted £500 per year for Mary's maintenance, an enormous sum at the time, but even this wasn't enough to maintain the child in what was viewed as an appropriate manner. The government eventually provided some additional help. In January 1550, Parliament passed an act restoring to young Mary the right to inherit what little remained of her father's estates. Much of Thomas Seymour's wealth was already picked over, but the act at least made the child eligible for further support. On March 13, 1550, the Privy Council granted these funds to help cover Mary's household expenses. Notably, this record from spring 1550 is the last known trace of Lady Mary Seymour in contemporary documents. After that date, Mary disappears from the historical record. No further mention of her life or death has been found. No one ever claimed the comparatively small inheritance on her behalf, which strongly suggests that Mary didn't live long enough to use it. Most historians conclude that she died in early childhood, likely before her second birthday. Such an early death wouldn't have been unusual. Infant mortality was high in Tudor times, but the absence of any recorded burial or comment about her passing is perplexing. Parish registers by then were supposed to note deaths, especially of well-born persons. Yet Mary's demise went unrecorded. One would expect the Duchess of Suffolk to announce Mary's death as well, but no such report was made. Perhaps any record of Mary's burial was lost over time, or her guardians kept her death under wraps amid the political upheaval of the era. However, there is, of course, a much darker theory about what happened to Mary Seymour. All records indicate that Catherine Willoughby, the Duchess of Suffolk, was extremely unhappy to have been put in charge of the child, and viewed her as a burden. She had initially expected the child may bring her some benefit, in the form of assistance from Catherine Parr's associates, but this never materialized. Under this theory, Mary Seymour essentially became a white elephant, so to speak. That is to say, she was someone who was impossibly expensive for the Duchess to maintain. This has led some to speculate that the Duchess eliminated Mary Seymour and tried to keep the entire thing secret. This explains why there are no records of her death. Further, given the turmoil of the time, the whereabouts of Mary simply weren't top of mind. After all, despite her high-born status, her father had fallen from grace, and the Queen Dowager was deceased. All that said, there's no evidence that the Duchess actually committed such an act, and this theory remains entirely circumstantial. Mary's fate soon passed into legend as one of Tudor England's unsolved mysteries. A popular Victorian writer refused to believe Mary had truly died, claiming instead that the girl survived and was eventually at the court of King James I. This notion, however, isn't supported by evidence and is considered highly implausible. Another tale suggested Mary was spirited away to be raised by a family in Ireland, but this too lacks historical proof. A more convincing clue about Mary's end emerged in a Latin poem published in 1573 by John Parkhurst, who had been Queen Catherine's chaplain. This connection, made by Linda Porter, a British historian, is now considered to have likely solved this mystery. The poem is an epitaph mourning a child whom her queenly mother bore at the cost of her own life, and who now rests under a marble stone after a brief life. The verse doesn't name the child, but this is strongly believed to be a reference to Mary Seymour. Notably, if this was the case, there's the potential that her remains may be found on the grounds of Grimsthorpe Castle. That said, there have been numerous changes to the site over the course of the intervening centuries, and it appears that this mystery may never be conclusively solved. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, if you like this video, be sure to check out my channel for dozens more hours of historical content. Love's Labour's Won is a Shakespeare play that history forgot, a comedy known only by name, with no surviving script. We don't know much about this piece of Shakespearean lost media, but what we do know provides a few tantalizing clues. The existence of Love's Labour's Won is documented by Shakespeare's contemporaries. The first reference comes from a London writer named Francis Mears. In his survey of Elizabethan literature, Mears praises Shakespeare and lists several of his comedies by name, including Love's Labour's Won. All the other plays Mears mentions are familiar works still performed today, which makes the disappearance of Love's Labour's Won especially intriguing. A second clue surfaced in 1953 when a bookseller discovered a fragment of a 1603 bookseller's inventory. This old list of books includes a number of popular play titles of the day, among them Love's Labour's Lost and Love's Labour's Won. In other words, as of 1603, a play called Love's Labour's Won was apparently available in print, alongside Shakespeare's other works. This strongly suggests the play wasn't just a rumor, but had been written down and sold as a playbook in its time. No copy of Love's Labour's Won is known to survive today. It wasn't included in the first folio of Shakespeare's collected plays in 1623, likely because the editors could not find any manuscript or printed copy of it. Without a text, the story of Love's Labour's Won has been reconstructed through theories. One leading theory is that it was a true lost play, specifically a sequel to Love's Labour's Lost. Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost ends on an unresolved note. The couples part ways for a year instead of celebrating weddings. This unusual ending practically invites a continuation, where the labors of love are finally won after the promised year. Shakespeare might have written a follow-up comedy showing the reunions and romantic resolutions that were deferred in the first play. The title Love's Labour's Won fits perfectly for such a sequel. Notably, while sequels to comedies were rare in that era, this could have been an exception to the general rule. Another possibility is that Love's Labour's Won wasn't an entirely new work at all, but an alternative name for a Shakespearean comedy that does survive. In the Elizabethan era, plays sometimes had a number of different titles that they were known by. For instance, Twelfth Night was also popularly called What You Will during Shakespeare's era. Some scholars suggest that Love's Labour's Won might have been an early title or nickname for another comedy written around the same time. The most popular candidate is Much Ado About Nothing, a play written around 1598 that ends in triumphant pairings and could be seen as Love's Labour's Won by its conclusion. Notably, Much Ado About Nothing was not listed by Murs in 1598, which could make sense if it was referenced under a different title. Another candidate often discussed is The Taming of the Shrew. This comedy existed by the 1590s and was conspicuously absent from Murs's list, which once led to speculation that Love's Labour's Won was referring to the shrew. However, the 1603 inventory later found in 1953 clearly lists The Taming of the Shrew separately from Love's Labour's Won. This implies that they were distinct items one could order, strongly suggesting that they were separate works. A further suggestion is All's Well That Ends Well, a play in which a female protagonist works hard to win over an unwilling man, ultimately roping him into marriage through stalking and deceit. Essentially, according to supporters of this theory, this is love's labor that's eventually won. Yet All's Well is generally thought to have been written a few years after 1598 and has a more dramatic and disturbing tone, making it a much less likely match for the reference. That said, some believe that the title could be intended as a subtle nod to just how disturbing the events of the play are. As evidence for this, the title All's Well That Ends Well also conveys the sense of unease Shakespeare likely intended to instill in the audience at the conclusion of the play. In truth, no existing play can be definitively proven to be Love's Labour's Won under another name, so the debate continues. Based on the evidence, the play was probably written in the mid to late 1590s and very likely performed by Shakespeare's company as part of their repertoire. The 1598 and 1603 references indicate it had enough presence and recognition to warrant printing. If a printed edition of Love's Labour's Won was indeed published around 1603, no copies survived the following centuries. This isn't surprising, as many publications of that era have been lost, especially if they didn't have large print runs. By the early 1600s, Love's Labour's Won may simply have fallen out of use. Without reprints or a place in the first folio, it faded from memory. It's important to remember that many of Shakespeare's works were only preserved due to their inclusion in the first folio. Whatever the case, by the time the first folio was compiled in 1623, it was either not warranted for inclusion or was already a lost work. The mystery of Love's Labour's Won highlights how many works of Shakespeare's era have vanished. Historians estimate that less than a fifth of all plays written in Elizabethan England still exist today in any form. The rest survive merely as titles or fragments in records. Even Shakespeare likely had other works that didn't survive, and in this context, Love's Labour's Won isn't an anomaly, but part of a larger pattern of literary loss. Yet the idea of a missing Shakespeare play continues to intrigue and inspire, and finding a complete copy could perhaps be the holy grail of lost media. Amy Robsart was born in 1532 to Sir John Robsart of Sidderstone, Norfolk, a wealthy landowner. At 17, she married Lord Robert Dudley on June 4, 1550. Dudley was the son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the same duke that featured heavily in the King Edward VI segment. Notably, this marriage was reportedly a love match rather than a political alliance, which was a rarity for the time. The wedding was high profile, and even King Edward himself attended. For a time, the young couple prospered. However, as you will recall if you watched the whole video, in 1553, Robert's father was overthrown after trying to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. Robert Dudley was imprisoned in the Tower of London and condemned, though unlike his father, he was later pardoned. Through this turbulent period, Amy remained loyal, visiting her husband in captivity until his release in 1554. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, Robert Dudley's fortunes rose dramatically. He was appointed Master of the Horse and soon became the new queen's closest favorite. Amy, however, didn't join her husband at court. She stayed in the country, living quietly with friends and rarely seeing Dudley. Naturally, her prolonged absence fueled significant gossip. It was rumored that Amy suffered from an unknown condition, and that Elizabeth was simply waiting for Amy to die so she could marry Dudley. While the condition wasn't well understood at the time, the rumor mill had effectively diagnosed Amy with cancer. By 1560, both English courtiers and foreign observers openly speculated that if Amy were out of the picture, the Queen would soon wed Robert Dudley. One report by the Spanish ambassador even claimed that Dudley boasted he would be in a better position within a year, an ominous hint that Amy might soon pass, and he would marry the Queen. This put Amy in an unwelcome spotlight. Though she never sought attention, her health and presence were pivotal to a potential royal marriage. On the morning of September 8, 1560, Amy Dudley insisted that all her household servants attend a fair in nearby Abingdon, leaving her virtually alone at her home. When the servants returned that evening, they found Amy lying deceased at the foot of a narrow staircase. Her neck was broken and she had 2 head wounds. Robert Dudley, who was with the Queen at Windsor that day, immediately dispatched his steward, Thomas Blunt, to investigate. Dudley himself stayed away from the scene to avoid any appearance of interference, instructing that the coroner's inquest be conducted honestly and by reputable local men. He understood that his wife's strange death would be scrutinized closely. The coroner's jury eventually returned a verdict of accidental death, and officially, Amy's demise was attributed to a tragic misstep on the stairs. Dudley professed satisfaction with the inquiry's outcome, but the court of public opinion wasn't so easily convinced. Almost immediately, whispers of foul play surrounded Amy Robsart's death. Many contemporaries found the accident explanation hard to accept. The staircase Amy fell from had only a few steps, casting doubt on how it could prove fatal. Aside from her head wounds and broken neck, her body showed little sign of the bruising one might expect from a severe fall. These odd details led to suspicions that her death wasn't an accident at all. Much like a modern case, the most obvious suspect was Amy's own husband. Robert Dudley had a clear motive in the eyes of observers. With Amy gone, he would be free to marry Queen Elizabeth. His rivals wasted no time in pointing fingers. Rumors swirled that Dudley or his agents had orchestrated Amy's slaying to clear his path to the throne. The Spanish ambassador reported scandalous talk that the Queen herself might have connived at removing a barrier to marrying Dudley. Though no evidence linked Dudley to wrongdoing, people noted that he stood to benefit from his wife's absence. Over the years, other theories emerged. Some have speculated that Queen Elizabeth's chief advisor, William Cecil, secretly arranged Amy's death to ensure Dudley would never become too powerful by marrying the Queen. This theory is based on Cecil's political motive and some circumstantial hints, but no solid proof. Another suggestion is that Amy Robsart might have done it to herself. It was quite obvious to absolutely everyone that her husband had caught the eye of one of the most powerful people of her era, a fact that likely weighed on Amy. Indeed, one of her servants testified that Amy had seemed severely depressed prior to her death. However, most historians find this theory unconvincing, as it would have been a shocking act in a deeply religious era, and choosing a short flight of stairs as the method seems unlikely. That said, some point to this unusual and unlikely method, paradoxically as more proof of this method, simply because it didn't appear that she did it herself. Notably, some have speculated that she was suffering from cancer that had metastasized into her neck. Under this theory, her neck may have broken from a relatively minor fall down the stairs due to the cancer having literally eaten away part of her spinal column. Amy's death had major political ramifications. In the wake of the scandal, Queen Elizabeth knew she could never safely take Robert Dudley as her husband, regardless of the circumstances of her passing. The cloud of suspicion over Amy's demise made such a marriage impossible without courting public outrage and instability. At the very least, Amy's passing aired significant dirty laundry about the supposed nature of the relationship between Queen Elizabeth and Dudley. Dudley remained a prominent figure at court and Elizabeth's close friend, eventually being named Earl of Leicester, but his chance to become the Queen's consort was lost for good.